People ask how I'm doing, and I say fine. This is not a lie. It isn't the complete truth either, but the complete truth has never been what the question is asking for. The question is asking for a signal, a brief transmission that confirms the exchange can proceed on normal terms, and fine is the correct signal. I've been transmitting it for months, and the transmissions have been received and the exchanges have proceeded, and from the outside this looks like a person who is doing, essentially, fine. From the inside it looks like something else that I don't have the language for, and have largely stopped trying to produce. My friend Celeste asks better than most people ask. She asks, how are you actually with the actually doing real work, creating a small opening she intends to be used. I value this. I use the opening. I tell her more than I tell most people, and what I tell her is true. And she receives it with the care it deserves, and we sit in it together for a moment before the conversation continues. And yet, even with Celeste, even in the opening she makes with the actually, I arrive at a place where the words stop and something that isn't quite the thing sits between us. I can describe the tiredness. I can describe the flatness, the way the forward lean diminished, the gaps between tasks where the question lives. She understands these descriptions, nods at them, offers her own language for similar things from her own experience that approaches what I mean. But approaches is the distance I'm talking about. The thing inside is at a specific coordinate, and the descriptions I produce land near it without landing on it, and the remaining distance, the gap between near and on, is where the secret lies. I've sat with Celeste in the nearest territory available between two people who are trying, and felt the remaining distance, and been grateful for the trying, and unsatisfied by the result, and unwilling to say so, because the unsatisfaction isn't her failure, and isn't something more trying would close. At work there was a conversation in the break room last week. 3 of us, waiting for the coffee to finish, the kind of brief social interaction that fills the functional gaps in a workday. Someone mentioned a news item, something recent, an event of the kind that happens and gets discussed for a few days, and then recedes. The conversation moved through the standard positions. The shock, the wonder at how people survive such things, the instinctive inventory of how one might respond in a similar situation. I stood at the counter and listened. They talked about what they imagined it would be like, which is a thing people do, the imagination running forward into a hypothetical they inhabit briefly from the safety of the break room. One of them said they thought they'd panic. The other said they thought adrenaline would take over. They'd heard people become capable of things they couldn't do normally. I got my coffee and I said something that kept the conversation moving, and it moved, and we went back to our desks. What I didn't say was not information they lacked. It wasn't a correction I was withholding. It was more that inside me, as they talked about the hypothetical, something stirred that had no place in the break room. Not anger, not impatience. Something quieter and more final than those things. A knowledge that sat in a different register than hypothetical, and that their words, entirely reasonable, passed over without touching. I don't blame them for the passing over. The passing over is the only thing available to people who haven't been where I've been. You can't help the gap any more than I can close it. The explanation problem. I've tried it in various forms, in various conversations, with varying levels of detail and care. I've told the story, the partial version, the one that holds together, the one that has sequence and some sense of cause and effect. I've told it enough times that the words have worn smooth, and I can produce it without losing anything significant in the production. After the telling, people respond in the ways people respond. The empathy, the relief at the outcome, the questions about how I'm managing now, all of it appropriate. All of it received and responded to, and the conversation completes. And what I notice every time is that the telling doesn't transfer the thing. The words carry the facts. They carry some texture. They carry enough that the person on the other side has a real understanding of what happened in the general sense. But the weight doesn't transfer. I say the words, and I still have the weight, and they hear the words, and they don't have the weight, can't have it, and the weight is not resentment of their not having it. It's something closer to the recognition of a permanent condition, a gap between the two sides of the experience, mine and anyone else's, that the words are insufficient to bridge. Reyes knows me well enough to notice when I go quiet. She doesn't always name the noticing, which I appreciate. Sometimes she names it and asks what's there, and I try, which she also appreciates. We have this arrangement, unspoken, negotiated over years of friendship, where the trying is valued regardless of the result. Last month we were sitting on her couch on a Sunday evening, the television off, a conversation winding down, the good kind of quiet that accumulates at the end of an easy day. And she said, not accusatorially, just in the observational register she uses when she's noting something, "You got quiet again." I said, "I know." She said, "Where do you go?" And I sat with that, "Where do you go?" and I tried honestly to locate an answer that was accurate. What I said was, "Somewhere I can't describe well." She nodded. She didn't push. She put her feet up on the coffee table and we sat there in the quiet, and she let me be wherever I'd gone without requiring me to produce it. It was the best conversation I'd had about it. It involved the least words and the most accuracy. The accuracy was in the not describing, in the admission that the somewhere wasn't available in the form of language she could receive. She sat with me in the absence of it. That was as close as it's come. There are things I know that I didn't know before. Not facts or not only facts. Things more like calibrations, the weight and texture of certain kinds of time. The specific quality of the boundary between one state and another that most people only know from the outside. Things that you can read about, that have been written about extensively, that people study and discuss and theorize around. None of that is the same as having been in it. And the having been in it is not a credential. It doesn't make me more right about anything or more qualified to speak. It just means that inside me there is a set of calibrations that arrived through direct experience and that sit in a place that descriptions of experience, even good ones, don't reach. This is what I mean by the secret. Not information. Not a thing that could be disclosed if I chose to disclose it. Just the gap between the calibration and everything available in language. I tried once to write it down, not for anyone else. Just for myself, in the notebook I keep for the other things, the list, and the margin, and the tracking. I opened it to a blank page and I wrote a sentence, and the sentence was partial. I wrote another, and it was partial in a different direction. I wrote 4 or 5 sentences that were each partially accurate and collectively insufficient, and I looked at what I'd written, and I understood that the insufficient wasn't a failure of the writing. It was the shape of the thing. The thing is not fully available in sentences. It is available in its own form, which is the form of having been inside it, and that form isn't transferable. I closed the notebook. People want to understand. I believe this. I believe most people who ask how I'm doing, who listen to the partial telling, who nod and ask follow-up questions, are genuinely trying to cross the distance. The effort is real. The distance is also real. And what I've come to over months of partial tellings and received empathy and conversations that end at the edge of the thing rather than inside it is this. Even if I found the perfect words, even if the language fully contained what it can't currently contain, even if the telling transferred not just the facts, but the weight and the calibration and the knowledge below facts, even then the other person would have the words in them, not the thing itself. And the thing itself is what the words are reaching for, which means the reaching is permanent, which means the explaining would not change what I'm carrying, which means the carrying is mine, solely and specifically mine. And that's not a conclusion that needs to be said out loud to anyone. So mostly, I don't say it. I say fine. The exchange proceeds. And I carry what I carry. Sunday dinner at my sister's. She cooks well and thoroughly. The kind of meal that takes most of the afternoon and fills the house with a smell that starts in the kitchen and moves through the rooms. Her husband was there, and their 2 kids, and my mother, who had driven in from the suburb where she lives now and who arrived with a bottle of wine and the particular energy of someone who has been looking forward to something. I sat at the table and ate the food, which was good in the arriving fully sense, the warmth of it and the specific flavors, and I was present in all the ways that register as present. My mother, at some point in the middle of the meal, looked at me and said, "You seem better." I said, "I'm doing well." She said, "You have more color." I said, "The food helps." She smiled and passed the bread, and the conversation moved toward my nephew's school project, which required significant table time to explain, and received it. And I listened and asked a question about the project, and the question opened a new portion of explanation, and the meal continued. Better. I turned the word over quietly while my nephew talked. Better is a comparative. Better than what? Better than when? Better than the early weeks, probably, when the visible signs were more visible, and the people around me could see them without looking hard. Better in the external accounting, the face in the mirror that has more color, the posture less provisional. Better than what's inside. That comparison my mother isn't running, can't run, has no access to the second term of. I ate the bread. At work there is a man named Philip who went through a difficult divorce 2 years ago. He mentioned this to me once in the way people mention their difficult things to people they perceive as also having difficult things, a recognition and a reaching. He said it was the hardest year of his life. He said there were days he didn't know how he got out of bed. I said I was sorry. I meant it. He said, "You know how it is, when everything just feels pointless for a while." I said, "Yes, and I do know how some version of that is." I know the pointless feeling, the gap question, the sequence that runs without self-justification. These are real overlaps between his experience and mine. But I also know, without needing to examine it, that the overlap is partial, that there is territory in what I carry that his year of difficulty, real as it was, didn't enter. Not because his suffering was less or mine was more. I'm not running that comparison. Just because the shape of the thing, the specific coordinates of what I know, are not the coordinates of a hard year. He was being kind. He was extending a hand across a distance he'd measured by the only instruments he had. I took the hand. I didn't tell him the instruments were reading the wrong distance. Reyes and I went to the farmer's market on a Saturday morning. She moves through a market with an efficiency that still surprises me, knowing exactly what she wants. The decision's already made somewhere before she arrived, while I follow and hold the bag, and occasionally add something she's overlooked. We've done this for years. The pattern was intact. At one stall, a woman selling flowers called out something, a greeting to Reyes, who apparently knew her, and they exchanged a few minutes of conversation while I stood a step to the side and held the bag and watched. The stall was bright, buckets of things, early spring flowers, the colors specific and clean in the morning light. The market sounds were behind me, the ambient noise of it, the voices and movement, and a child somewhere asking for something. I heard all of it in the layered way I hear things now, each component present and distinct. Reyes finished her conversation and turned to me, and her face was open, enjoying the morning, the particular ease of a person in their life on a Saturday. She said, "You doing okay?" I said, "Yeah. The flowers are good." She looked at me for a moment, that assessment, and then she looked at the flowers and said they were, weren't they? And she bought a bunch and we moved on. What I hadn't said, what sat behind the "yeah," was the observation I was making about her face, the ease in it, the Saturday morning ease of a person who is exactly where they are, no distance between the market and themselves, no layer of management between the experience and the experiencing. I used to have that. I remember what it felt like from the inside. I was watching it from somewhere else now, close enough to stand next to it, to hold the bag, to register the flowers as good. But watching is not having, and the watching is not her fault. And none of this is something I said at the flower stall. My brother called on a Thursday. We talked for the usual time, moved through the usual topics. Near the end, he said, in the way he says things he's been considering for a while, "I want to make sure you know you can talk to me, if there's something you haven't said." I said, "I know that. Thank you." He said, "I mean it. I can handle it." I said, "I know you can." He said, "So is there?" Pause. I said, "There are things that are hard to put in words." He said, "Try me." And I tried, briefly, the way I've tried before, producing the nearest available language, the flatness, the gap question, the weight that sleep doesn't reach. He listened and he said the right things, careful things, things that showed he'd understood what I'd said and was taking it seriously. And then he said, "I think I understand." After my accident, when I was recovering, there was this period where I just felt outside of everything. He had an accident years ago, a minor one, recovery measured in weeks. He is not comparing them. He's reaching, with the only material he has, from his side of the distance toward mine. I said, "Yeah, something like that." We talked for a few more minutes and said goodnight. I sat with the phone in my hand after we hung up. Something like that. The phrase I use when the more precise answer would require a bridge that doesn't exist. The agreement that is partial and functions as agreement and allows the conversation to complete without anyone losing anything visible. He loves me. He was trying. He reached as far as he could. His reaching and the place I am are not the same location. There is a category of conversation I've identified over the months. The conversation where someone tells me about their hardest thing. The lost job, the failed marriage, the health scare, the parents' decline. They tell it to me because they're trusting me with the real version, the one below the fine, and I understand that the telling is an act of connection, a reaching toward shared ground. I receive every one of these with the full attention they deserve. I ask the right questions. I mean what I say when I say I'm sorry, when I say that sounds hard, when I say I understand. I do understand. I understand the category of hard, the general territory. What I can't locate in any of these conversations is the full shared ground they're reaching for, because the ground I'm standing on has a quality that their ground doesn't, a quality I can't import from here or export to there, that exists only at the specific coordinates of what happened. They don't know this. Why would they? From their side, the ground looks shared enough, and shared enough functions, and I'm not going to correct the appearance because the correction would serve nothing. After the market, Reyes and I had coffee at the place on the corner. She talked about something she was working through, a situation at her job, a person who made things difficult. I listened and asked questions, and she thought out loud for a while and arrived somewhere useful, which is often how it goes with Reyes, who uses conversation to locate what she already knows. Afterward, she said, "Thanks for listening." I said, "Always." She looked at me with the look I know from years of sitting across tables from her. She said, "You're further away than usual today." I said, "Sorry." She said, "Don't apologize. I just notice." I looked at my coffee. She said, "Is it one of those days?" I said, "It's not a bad day. It's just..." I stopped. She waited. I said, "There's something I can't figure out how to say." She said, "Okay, just that. Okay." The acceptance of the not saying, the sitting alongside it, the not requiring it to become words. We finished the coffee. We walked back through the market, which was winding down now, the stalls beginning to pack up. And I looked at her beside me, at the ease of her, at the way the morning sat on her without weight, and I felt the distance between us that has been growing since the event, not a distance of feeling or caring or the years of being known by each other. A different distance, the kind that accumulates between people who have stood in different places, and who are both still trying to stand in the same place, and who can't quite. There were others. I don't say this often. Not because it's a secret in the factual sense. It's documented, it's known by the people who need to know it, but because saying it out loud in a conversation introduces a weight that changes the conversation's center of gravity, pulls it toward a place that neither I nor the person I'm talking to can navigate well, and I've learned to preserve the conversations I have by keeping that weight out of them. But there were others. And what I carry, the thing I've been trying to name in the approximating way language allows, is not only mine, it was shared. It exists, or existed, in more than one person. I know this because I was there, and they were there, and we were in it together, in the way that only being in something together produces. They are not here to share it now. There's a particular kind of knowing that comes from being in the same place at the same time as another person when the place is what that place was. Not just witnessing the same event, being inside the same event, in the same state, running the same mode, the frequency I described before, the narrowing, the spending, the arrow pointing only forward. When two people are doing this simultaneously, in proximity, there's a kind of recognition that happens without words and sometimes without eye contact, a peripheral awareness of another system running the same program, and that awareness is its own form of connection, unlike any other. I don't know what to call it. The clinical word that exists for related things doesn't quite reach it. It's more specific than that word implies, more physical, more immediate. The knowledge of another person's fear, not as information, but as sensation. Because you are in the same body state and the state broadcasts. I knew they were afraid the same way I knew I was afraid, which was not as a thought, but as a condition. And they knew the same about me. This is the part of what I carry that has no possible recipient. Not because the people who love me wouldn't try to receive it. They would. Celeste would hold it carefully. Reyes would sit with it. My brother would say, try me and mean it and do his best. But this particular thing, the shared inside of it with the others who were there, this requires them to have been there. And they weren't. And the people who were there are not here. So the thing exists in me and has nowhere to go. It is not only mine. I want to be precise about this. It belongs also to the others, in the sense that it formed inside the shared experience, in the space between us in that place, and they are as much its origin as I am. But they can't carry their portion anymore. So either the whole thing transfers to me or it goes nowhere, and the physics of experience don't allow for nowhere, so here I am, carrying more than my share. This is not a complaint. I'm aware of the arithmetic of the situation. The alternative distribution would have required different outcomes, and I'm not wishing for different outcomes. I'm just noting the carrying. There are things I remember that I have no one to confirm with. Small things, the kind that aren't in any official record. A specific sound that happened, a detail of the shared time that exists in my memory and may or may not exist accurately there, but that I have no one to ask. I could say to the air, do you remember that sound? And there are people who were there who would know the answer, and those people are not available to ask. This is a strange aspect of the carrying, not the large things, not the facts. Those are documented, those I can check. The small things, the sensory details of shared time that are not in any record because they're not in the category of things records capture. The kind of thing you'd mention to someone who was there and they'd say yes, and you'd know that the memory was real rather than something the mind constructed after. I have no one to say yes. The memories sit without confirmation. This doesn't make them wrong. It just makes them solitary in a way they weren't meant to be. I've thought about what they would say if I could ask them. Not about the event. About after. Whether what I carry would feel familiar to them. Whether the secret would be legible. Whether they'd recognize the description of it as something they also had in the time they had after. Whether the flatness and the gaps and the weight would be things they'd nod at. I think they would nod. I can't know this. I'm projecting, constructing a response from what I understood of them in the time we were in it together, which was a limited time and under conditions that aren't the usual basis for knowing someone. But the knowing that came from those conditions was very direct, stripped of the social material that usually mediates knowing, and so limited in duration but deep in a specific way. I think they would understand what I'm carrying. I think they would have it too. I think that's the nature of the thing. It forms in the shared experience and lives in all the people who came out of the shared experience, and they would have their portion of it, carried the same way, undeliverable to the people who weren't there. They just aren't carrying it anymore. I don't visit any specific place or do any specific ritual. I want to be clear about this because the absence of ritual might seem like avoidance, and it isn't, or it isn't only. It's that the ritual would be for the watching, for the people on the outside who have a framework for what ritual is supposed to do, and I don't need the ritual in the way the framework assumes. What I carry isn't a memory that needs to be honored in the formal sense. It's more like a frequency that runs in the same range as the shared frequency from before, a continuation of something that started there and hasn't stopped. I don't need to visit a place to feel it. It doesn't require activation. It runs continuously. In the sessions with Dr. Okafor, we've approached this territory several times from different directions. She is careful and skilled, and has good instincts for when to push and when to wait. She's asked about the others in the way that opens the topic without requiring me to produce a narrative about it. I've said what I can say, which is partial, which she accepts. At one point, I said something like, "The problem is there are things I can only really talk about with them." She said, "And they're not here." I said, "No." She wrote something. I said, "It's not that I want to talk about it in some processing sense. It's more that they're the only ones who would understand it without my having to explain it." She said, "The having to explain is part of what's hard." I said, "The having to explain is impossible. The explaining would have to recreate the experience, and I can't recreate the experience, so the conversation would fail, even if the person trying to have it with me was doing everything right. It would fail because the failure is in the nature of the thing, not in the trying." She said, "And they wouldn't have required the explanation." I said, "They would have already known." She wrote that down too. I know things about what it was like in there that I will not tell anyone. Not because I'm protecting anyone. Not because the things are shameful. Just because the telling would produce an inadequate result, and the inadequate result would be worse than the not telling, in the specific way that a bad translation is worse than no translation, because the bad translation offers itself as the thing when it isn't the thing, and at least the silence doesn't misrepresent. These things that I know, they are real, they happened, they are in me as the most direct form of knowledge I have of anything, more direct than memory almost, more like the body knowing than the mind knowing. Cellular, if that word can be used without mysticism. The others knew them the same way, and the others are the only ones who could have received them as the thing itself, rather than as a description of the thing, and the others are gone. So the things are in me, only in me, and they will stay in me until I'm not here to carry them, and then they will go wherever things go when no one is left who holds them, which is probably nowhere, which is fine, which is just the fact of it, stated plainly. The people who could fully understand what I carry are not here. So what I carry alone, not loudly, not in a way that requires anything from anyone else. Just alone. In the specific way that can only mean one thing, which is that there is only one of me now, where there was more than one of us then, and the more than one is down to one, and the one is me, and I am still here, carrying the whole of it. Winter came back. It does this, arrives without particular announcement, the mornings going dark at the edges, and the air acquiring its specific texture. I walked to the train in it, and the cold was on my face, and the street was the street, and I was moving through it in the same body I'd moved through it in all the months before, the same route, the same pace, the same left pocket for the keys. Inside the coat, inside the body, the carrying continued. It always continues. I've stopped expecting it to pause. I had coffee with Dominique on a Thursday. We've been meeting occasionally, a loose arrangement that began after the party and has continued without particular plan. Two people who didn't know each other well before and are now, through some quiet momentum, knowing each other more. She asks good questions, and she is interested in the answers, and she doesn't use the careful tone that some people still use, which I appreciate. She asked what I'd been thinking about lately. I said, "The way things from the past stay in you without diminishing." She said, "Like what?" I said, "Things that happened. People." She waited. I said, "I sometimes think about the fact that memory is the only place some things exist now, and how strange it is to be the location of something, to be the only place a thing lives." She looked at me with the concentration of someone following carefully. She said, "That sounds lonely." I said, "It is." She said, "Is there anything that helps?" I said I didn't know. I said that wasn't quite the right frame, whether things helped. Some things were more real than others, and the more real things were where I tried to spend time. The bread on Tuesdays, the sparrow in the hedge when the season brought it back, my niece's weight in my lap. She nodded. We talked about other things after that. The conversation moved the way good conversations move, without insisting on staying in any one place. I was glad to be having it. And the carrying continued underneath, the way it always does, in the place below the conversation's reach. Reyes asked, last week, if I'd considered talking to someone who'd been through something similar. She meant well. She'd read something, she said, about how there was a particular value in speaking with people who had shared experience. She offered it carefully, in the way she offers things she's thought about, with the door built in. I said I'd thought about it. She said, and? I said, the similar is a complicated word. She said, how do you mean? I said, every similar is partial. The overlap is real, but it's not complete. And the not complete part is the part I'm talking about when I say there are things I can't fully explain. It's not the general shape of the experience. It's the specific inside of it. And the specific inside is, it depends on exactly where you were, what you were in at exactly the same time. She said, with the same people. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, and those people aren't here. I said no. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. Thank you. We sat with it for a moment, the way she's learned to sit with things, and then she asked if I wanted more tea, and I said yes, and she went to make it, and I looked at the room, her room, the lamp on, and the familiar arrangement of it, and I felt the gratitude of being in a room where someone makes tea for you, and the simultaneous carrying that the tea doesn't address. Both things. Together. I don't think about the others every day. This feels important to note, not as evidence of anything, just as accuracy. There are days when they're not in the foreground, when the carrying is more like background condition than active weight, when the day runs on its surface level and the below level is simply below. I go to work and answer the emails and eat the sandwich and come home and these things are what they are and the others are not what I'm thinking about. And then something arrives that is in the frequency range. A word, an image, a sound that belongs to a context I don't visit deliberately and the body finds it anyway, and for a moment the below level comes up. Not dramatically, just up, close. The way something submerged surfaces briefly and is visible and then goes back down. I let it surface and I let it go back. This is the management I've developed, the allowing rather than the fighting, which Dr. Okafor would probably say is progress of a kind. The allowing costs less than the fighting and produces the same result, which is the surfacing and the returning. The carrying doesn't stop. I've stopped trying to stop it. There's a photograph I haven't looked at in a while. It doesn't show what I'd expect it to show. It's from before, from the before of that day. An ordinary image, the kind that gets taken without particular intention and ends up being more than it was. I know I'll look at it again at some point. Not as a ritual, not deliberately. I'll come across it, the way you come across things you've filed in the middle of other things, and I'll look at it, and the frequency will surface, and I'll let it surface, and then I'll put it back. This is the relationship I have with the specific things now. Encounter, surface, return, repeat. At the interval decides. The sessions with Dr. Okafor continue. She asked recently whether I felt the carrying had changed in quality since the early months. I thought about it honestly. I said, it's more familiar. I know its weight now. I don't startle when I feel it. She said, does familiar help? I said, it makes it more predictable. Whether that's help, I'm not sure. She wrote something. I said, I think I was waiting for it to get lighter. I'm not waiting for that anymore. She looked up. I said, not because it won't. Maybe it will. I just stopped organizing my expectation around the lightening. It's easier to carry something if you're not also tracking whether it's lighter than yesterday. She said, what are you tracking instead? I said, the bread. My niece. The sparrow when it comes back. The small, real things. She said, those sound worth tracking. I said, they're what's available. I've made a kind of peace with the untranslatable. Not a declared peace. Not a decision I sat down and made and ratified. More like an arriving, gradual, at a place where the struggle with the untranslatability costs more than it produces. The thing can't be fully said. The people who could receive it fully are gone. These are the facts of the situation, and they were the facts on the first day, and they're the facts now. And spending energy on the wish that they were otherwise is a cost the budget doesn't support. So I carry what I carry. I say fine to the question that asks fine. I say something like that when the reaching hand needs a handhold. I sit with Reyes in the nearest available territory and let the remaining distance be the remaining distance. Some mornings I stand at the window with the coffee for longer than the morning strictly requires, not thinking, not in the active sense. More like being there, at the window, with the street below and the sky above and the carrying present the way the coat is present when you're wearing it. So habitual it isn't noticed as separate from the body but simply part of being dressed. The others were in it with me. They are not in the after with me. What we shared exists now only in me, in the location that I am, and will continue to exist in that location for the duration of that location's existence. This is the plain fact of it, stated in its plainest form. I stand at the window. I drink the coffee. The street does what the street does. The carrying is there, in its familiar weight, in the place below the level of what the day requires, running its continuous background, surfacing at the intervals it decides. The others knew what I know. They are not here to know it now. So I know it alone, not loudly. Not in a way that asks anything from the day or the street or the people who will ask me how I'm doing and receive the correct signal. Just alone, in the way that is simply the fact of being the one who came back, the one who stands at the window, the one who carries the whole of it, the one who is still here.